Whenever we try to picture human evolution, there's this one highly specific image that just immediately pops into our collective consciousness.
Oh, right. The classic lineup.
Yes.
Yeah.
We've all seen it. It's in our school textbooks. It's on museum posters. I mean, it's printed on coffee mugs.
The famous March of Progress illustration.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That classic left to right lineup. On the far left, you've got this hunched over ape, knuckles dragging through the dirt, and then step by agonizing step, figure by figure, they start to stand up just, a little bit straighter.
Right, they start looking a bit more confident.
Yeah, they start holding a spear until finally, on the far right, there's a modern human, standing tall, chest puffed out, just striding forward like they have completely and utterly conquered the world.
It is a brilliant piece of visual marketing.
Yeah.
But it paints a highly deceptive, almost entirely fictional picture.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, it implies this narrative of sheer willpower. It suggests a biological journey driven by some internal, manifest destiny.
Right. It makes it look like our ancestors just woke up one morning, looked out from the branches of their trees at the vast African savanna, and made this conscious, heroic decision.
Like they were pioneers.
Exactly. Like they said, you know what? I'm tired of eating leaves. I'm going to bravely step out into the tall grass, stand proudly on two legs, and just dominate this entire food chain.
But that heroic, triumphant story is, well, it's a complete lie.
So what is the real story then, if we weren't brave pioneers?
The real story is about tiny, terrified apes who were physically trapped in an inescapable watery prison.
Wow.
Yeah. We're talking about apes that didn't conquer nature, but were passively and quite ruthlessly reshaped by the blind laws of physics, chemistry, and geography.
That's a massive shift in perspective. So for everyone listening, our mission for this deep dive is to completely dismantle that old school book myth.
Right. We need to explore what evolutionary biologists call the millions of years of solitude hypothesis.
The millions of years of solitude. Okay, I love that title. To really grasp the sheer terror and honestly, the monumental scale of this, we need to reset the stage entirely, right?
They do. We have to rewind the clock and go back to the African continent roughly 8 to 10 million years ago.
Paint that picture for us, because I know the Africa of 10 million years ago is not the Africa you and I see on wildlife documentaries today. It wasn't just endless grassland.
Not at all. At that time, a massive, continuous, lush rainforest blanketed Central and Eastern Africa.
Okay.
And living in the canopy of that continuous rainforest was a highly successful population of apes. We refer to them as the chimpanzee-human last common ancestor.
The CHLCA.
Right. They were a single, unified species. But beneath their feet, deep within the Earth's mantle, a massive plume of superheated magma was pushing upward.
Oh, wow.
And this geological violence began to literally stretch, fracture, and tear the African continental crust apart.
So this is the birth of the Great Rift Valley. And we aren't talking about, like, a small canyon opening up here. We are talking about a geological trench, thousands of miles long, with towering sheer cliffs and plunging volcanically active valleys.
It was a cataclysm. It physically tore the continent and that continuous rainforest completely in half.
It's like a giant geological ratchet just clicked into place. Once that valley opened up, there was no going back.
That is the crucial inciting incident. The CHLCA population was suddenly and violently bisected by this massive wall of rock and changing elevations.
So the population was permanently split?
Yes, into two distinct groups, a Western group and an Eastern group.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the apes that ended up on the west side of the Rift Valley, the ancestors of modern-day chimps and gorillas, they essentially won the geological lottery, didn't they?
They absolutely did. The Congo Basin to the west remained a remarkably stable, dense, and incredibly resource-rich rainforest.
So they didn't really need to change.
No, their environment stayed the same, so their bodies stayed the same. They kept their highly successful, tree-dwelling, knuckle-walking anatomy. They were the dominant majority.
But I imagine the apes that got trapped on the eastern side of this new wall, our ancestors, they did not hit the jackpot.
Far from it. Our direct ancestors were the isolated minority, physically trapped in what would become the Turkana-Baringo Basin in the east.
And things were changing fast over there.
Very fast. The Great Rift Valley didn't just create a physical wall. It created a massive rain shadow. It blocked the weather patterns coming off the oceans, meaning the east began to drastically dry out.
So that continuous forest canopy starts breaking apart.
Right, fragmenting into smaller pockets of forest, separated by spreading grasslands. But more importantly for our specific ancestors, the tectonic folding created massive closed basins.
Closed basins.
Think of them as giant geological bowls surrounded by highlands, with absolutely no river outlets flowing to the sea.
Okay, hold on. Let's focus on those specific ancestors trapped in the East for a second, because when I read the sources for this deep dive, the physical description of our early ancestors was genuinely shocking.
It usually is for people.
Yeah, because I always picture something robust, something the size of a modern human, or at least a really large muscular chimp that could hold its own in a fight. But the CHLCA, they were incredibly frail.
Extremely fragile. The fossil records indicate that these early ancestors stood barely 1 meter tall.
About 3 feet.
Yeah. And they weighed maybe 30 to 40 kilograms. They were slow on the ground. They lacked the massive muscle density of a modern gorilla. And they didn't have the sharp defensive canine teeth of, say, a baboon.
So they were basically bite-sized.
That's a good way to put it. And they were sharing this changing eastern landscape with some of the most terrifying apex predators that the planet has ever produced.
Giant saber-toothed cats, right?
Yes. Predators that are hard to even fathom today. Giant saber-toothed cats like Megatherion. Massive cursorial hyenas that could easily outrun anything on the plains.
Just lightning-fast killing machines.
Highly specialized killing machines, yes.
Which, I mean, that completely destroys that heroic myth of the savannah. If a 3-foot-tall, slow-moving ape decides to bravely step out of the trees and onto the open grass teeming with saber-toothed cats...
It doesn't evolve. It gets eaten within 10 minutes.
Exactly.
And that is the fundamental flaw in the old savanna hypothesis. The savanna was an immediate death sentence for a creature that small and defenseless.
Right.
They could not migrate. They physically could not cross the open plains to find better habitats. The only place they could survive was within their shrinking pockets of trees.
So if they couldn't leave the trees, how did we end up walking on the ground? I always assumed the forests just slowly vanished and eventually forced them down.
Well, the forest did shrink. But for a specific group of our ancestors in these closed tectonic basins, something far more bizarre happened.
Okay.
Remember those giant geological bowls with no outlet?
At the basins?
As tectonic shifts continued, the ground beneath their specific patches of forest began to literally sink. And at the same time, rainfall from the surrounding highlands drained down into these depressions.
And the water had nowhere to go.
Nowhere. So over thousands of years, the water slowly rose. They found themselves living in a flooded forest.
Wow.
And this is where the passive nature of our evolution really comes into focus.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because I picture this like being locked in a massive, slow-filling escape room, but the door is permanently jammed shut.
That's a great analogy.
The water is creeping up the trunks of the trees inch by inch, generation after generation. Now, my first instinct, and I think the instinct of you listening to this right now, would be to say, well, obviously, out of sheer self-preservation, they must have tried to swim out.
Right, wade to dry land and escape.
Yeah, surely they tried to leave.
It is a logical assumption.
Mm-hmm.
But let's look at the brutal mathematical reality of their environment.
The giant cats.
Exactly. Any individual who attempted to leave the flooded forest, who made it to the edge of the water, and tried to make a run for a dry forest across the savanna, they were instantly subjected to the ultimate environmental filter.
Which means mortality on the savanna was essentially 100%.
Yes. The only individuals who lived long enough to reproduce and pass on their genetic code were the ones who passively stayed in the flooded forest.
Because the big cats wouldn't follow them into the deep water.
Right.
The flood was terrifying, but it was also a moat. It was the only barrier keeping the monsters away. So they stayed, they clung to the branches above, and they dropped down into the water to look for food.
Yes.
But, okay, wait. How does living in a swamp turn a tiny ape into a bipedal human? We're not just talking about getting their feet wet here.
No, we are talking about deep water immersion. This wasn't a shallow puddle where they could just splash around because the basins were sinking. The water was chest deep, sometimes neck deep.
Okay.
Now, visualize a quadrupedal ape, an animal designed to walk on all fours with its spine parallel to the ground.
Right.
Imagine it dropping down from a branch into chest-deep water to look for food.
If they drop onto all fours, their head is completely submerged. They drown.
Precisely. If they want to keep their nose above the surface to breathe, and if they want to use their hands to feel around in the mud for, aquatic roots, water lilies, or shellfish.
They have absolutely no choice. They have to stand vertical.
Right. On their two hind legs. Bipedalism in this flooded environment was not a lifestyle choice.
But it wasn't them trying to see over the tall grass.
No. It was an absolute non-negotiable physical requirement for every single breath they took while foraging in the water.
Okay, that makes perfect sense for survival in the moment, but I'm looking at the biomechanics of this, and there is a massive glaring problem.
The joints.
Yes, if you take a tree-dwelling ape with a spine shaped like an arch and a long, narrow pelvis designed for climbing, and you suddenly force it to stand completely upright on dry land all day, its body would catastrophically fail.
The mechanical stress would be lethal. On dry land, gravity would exert a crushing downward force on a skeleton not built for it.
They just collapse.
They would suffer from shattered knee joints, severely herniated spinal discs, and pelvic fractures. A quadruped simply cannot become a biped overnight on land without destroying its own architecture.
But they weren't on land, they were in water, which means the water acted like a giant, millions of years long physical therapy pool.
That is the brilliance of the semi-aquatic incubator.
Oh, wow.
Think about the physics of it. When an animal is submerged chest deep, the upward force of buoyancy supports roughly 50 to 80% of its total body weight.
So it's basically an anti-gravity suspension system.
Exactly. This massive aquatic suspension system completely negated the lethal crushing force of gravity. It allowed these fragile apes to maintain an upright vertical posture all day long without shattering their unadapted joints.
So the water held them up, cradling their weight, while their bones and joints had the incredibly slow generational time, literally millions of years, to naturally remodel. The pelvis shortened and widened to support the organs. The spine developed that crucial S-curve to balance the head. The knee joints evolved to lock straight. And all of it happened safely suspended in water.
And because this isolated environment persisted for such an incredibly long time, the physical changes became permanently encoded in their biology.
Right.
But, the water in Lake Turkana wasn't just acting as a mechanical suspension system. It was actively chemically altering their biology.
Okay, this is where the story gets deeply, deeply strange. Because a flooded forest is one thing, but Lake Turkana was a closed basin.
Right.
Rivers flowed into it, carrying minerals from the volcanic rock, but nothing flowed out. Under that relentless equatorial sun, the water just evaporated.
And evaporation in a closed system leads to extreme chemical concentration. Over millennia, the waters of Lake Turkana became highly alkaline.
How alkaline are we talking?
We are talking about a massive body of water with a pH reaching between 9.5 and 10.
To put that chemistry into everyday terms for you listening, a pH of 10 is essentially the same as soaking in a giant vat of milk of magnesia, or even a mild household bleach.
Right.
And I keep picturing this absurd scenario. Our ancestors, covered in thick ape fur, soaking waist deep in a mild bleach solution for a few million years. It's basically a slow-acting continental scale bath of hair removal cream.
I mean, that is a biochemically accurate way to view it. Highly alkaline solutions are incredibly effective at denaturing keratin, which is the structural protein that makes up hair.
So it just melts away.
Over time, prolonged exposure to highly basic water would severely degrade their body hair, making it brittle and prone to falling out.
But beyond just the chemical degradation, there's a brutal survival logic to shedding that fur, right? If you're an ape forced to wade through deep water all day, thick fur is a massive liability.
It's an enormous physical hindrance. In the water, a thick coat of fur acts like a sponge. It creates massive hydrodynamic drag.
Which means moving through the water is exhausting.
Utterly exhausting. It burns precious calories. But the real lethal danger happens the moment they climb out of the water to sleep in the branches.
Because wet fur loses all of its insulating properties.
Entirely. When wind hits a thick coat of soaking wet fur, the rapid evaporation pulls heat away from the body's core at an incredibly fast, lethal rate.
So even in a sweltering equatorial climate, living constantly wet with thick fur is a fast track to hypothermia.
Exactly. The night air would freeze them.
So natural selection kicks into overdrive here. The alkaline water is already degrading the hair, and the individuals who naturally have slightly less hair are the ones who don't freeze to death shivering in the trees at night.
Right. They survive, they reproduce.
And over millions of years, the body fur essentially melts away, leaving behind smooth, naked skin that dries almost instantly in the breeze.
Leaving us as the only hairless primate.
But wait, if the water and the wind stripped all the fur off our bodies to prevent drag and hypothermia, why in the world do we still have this giant, thick patch of hair sitting right on top of our heads?
It seems like a biological contradiction, doesn't it?
It really does.
But it makes perfect sense when you look at the strict thermodynamics of a wading animal in the Turkana Basin.
Okay, walk me through it.
We are talking about an environment where the ambient daytime temperature routinely soared to 35 degrees Celsius.
Which is about 95 degrees Fahrenheit.
Right. It was a solar oven. Now, when the apes are wading chest deep, their core body temperature is perfectly regulated by the surrounding water.
The water is like a massive liquid cooling system.
Yes,
Yeah.
the body is chilled, but the head is sticking out,
Ah.
and the head, and more importantly, the brain inside it, which is the most metabolically expensive and heat-sensitive organ in the body, is sitting completely exposed above the waterline, taking the full, relentless radiation of the equatorial sun.
And if a primate's brain overheats by even a few degrees,
It causes heat stroke, seizures, and death.
so the hair on our heads is not cosmetic. It is a highly specialized, localized parasol.
A literal heat shield. Thick, tightly coiled curly hair, which was the original human hair texture, acts as a perfect thermal buffer. It creates a thick pocket of insulating dead air between the blazing sun and the scalp.
Preventing the direct radiant heat from baking the skull and boiling the brain.
Precisely.
So you end up with a creature stripped completely naked from the neck down by alkaline water and the threat of hypothermia, but sporting a thick, protective bush of hair on the very top of its head to block the sun.
It is a masterpiece of highly localized adaptation.
That is wild. That is not a pioneer bravely adapting to the plains. That is a body violently molded by the specific physical geometry of a hot alkaline swamp.
But, while their bones and their skin were being entirely re-engineered by the water, something equally profound was happening deep inside their cells.
In their DNA.
Right. The physical isolation of the Rift Valley was ensuring that their genetic code was on a completely separate, irreversible trajectory.
And this brings up a major genetic mystery that puzzled scientists for years. Let's correct the record on this split.
Ah, the interbreeding debate.
Yeah. Because if we look back to around 2006, the prevailing theory was that this split between the eastern apes and the western apes wasn't actually clean. The genomic data back then seemed to suggest a very messy breakup. It looked like early human ancestors and chimpanzee ancestors kept running into each other and interbreeding for millions of years after the Rift Valley formed.
That was a highly debated theory based on an anomaly in that 2006 data. When geneticists mapped the divergence of the genomes, most of our chromosomes show that we split from chimps roughly 6 to 7 million years ago.
Okay.
But the X chromosome was a massive outlier. The genetic clock on the X chromosome made it look like it had split a million years later than the rest of the DNA.
So the initial assumption was, well, they must have been sneaking across the border. That human ancestors and chimp ancestors were crossing paths, having hybrid babies, and this constant crossbreeding was continually overwriting the X chromosome.
Right, resetting its clock and making it look younger. That was the hypothesis of genetic introgression.
But then, a massive, comprehensive genomic update in 2013 completely dismantled that idea, right?
Entirely. They realized the younger appearance of the X chromosome had absolutely nothing to do with interbreeding. It was purely a mathematical artifact of how cells divide.
Because sperm and eggs don't mutate at the same speed.
Exactly the opposite. Spermatogenesis, the creation of sperm in males, involves continuous cell division throughout a male's entire life.
And every time a cell divides, there is a chance for a copying error, a mutation.
Right. Oogenesis in females is different. Females are born with all the eggs they will ever have. Cell division is paused. Therefore, male sperm mutates at a significantly higher rate than female eggs.
And since a male is XY and a female is XX, the X chromosome spends twice as much evolutionary time sitting inside females as it does inside males.
Which means the X chromosome has a much slower overall mutation rate than the rest of the genome. It literally ticks at a slower biological pace.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Once geneticists adjusted their mathematical models to account for this slower mutation clock, the timeline anomaly completely vanished. The data snapped into perfect alignment, proving a single, absolute, and completely clean split roughly 6 to 7.6 million years ago.
Zero interbreeding. A hard, clean break.
Absolutely clean.
And if you think about the physical realities of the Rift Valley, that makes perfect sense. But why is it so biologically crucial that they never crossbred again? What if a few of our bipedal ancestors had found a way back west?
If they had, the human species would simply not exist.
Really?
Think about the population dynamics. You have this tiny, isolated, highly stressed population in the east just beginning to develop the fragile genetic code for walking upright and losing their hair.
Okay.
Meanwhile, in the West, you have a massive, dominant, continent-spanning population of chimpanzee ancestors perfectly adapted to their environment.
Right. So if the tiny eastern group migrated back and interbred with the western group, it would be like dropping a single drop of blue food coloring into a massive swimming pool of red water. The blue doesn't change the pool, it just disappears.
The specialized, fragile genetic code for bipedalism would have been instantly diluted and erased by the overwhelming genetic volume of the quadrupedal majority. The physical, impassable wall of the Great Rift Valley was the ultimate quarantine.
It protected our bizarre mutations from being swallowed back up into the evolutionary mainstream.
It was an absolute necessity.
Now, to truly prove just how powerful and absolute this concept of evolutionary isolation is, I want to briefly flash forward in our timeline.
Okay.
Because millions of years later, after our ancestors finally perfected this bipedal, big-brained body, they eventually migrated out of Africa and into Eurasia. And when they got there, they ran into another human species that had left Africa hundreds of thousands of years earlier.
The Neanderthals.
The Neanderthals. Now, anyone who has taken a consumer DNA test knows the punchline here. Most modern people outside of sub-Saharan Africa carry about 1.5 to 2% Neanderthal DNA.
Right, the encounters in Ice Age Europe and Asia.
So the popular imagination naturally assumes a very romantic story. We assume sapiens and Neanderthals met, fell in love, happily coexisted around the campfire, and just seamlessly merged their populations together.
Just a nice thought.
But the biological truth is horrifyingly different, isn't it?
The reality was far from a peaceful merging of populations. To understand why we only have 2% of their DNA, we have to look at a foundational biological principle known as Haldane's rule.
JBS Haldane. He noticed something very specific about what happens when two species that have been separated for a long time try to crossbreed.
Right. Haldane recognized that when two distinct lineages try to hybridize, the biological software doesn't always mesh.
Okay, how so?
His rule states that in the hybrid offspring of two different species, if one sex is going to be sterile, absent, or suffers severe health defects, it is almost always the heterogametic sex.
The sex with two different sex chromosomes.
Precisely. Which, in mammals, is the male, who carries an X and a Y chromosome.
The classic everyday example of this is the mule. If you breed a female horse with a male donkey, you get a mule. But male mules are entirely sterile.
Yes.
Their genetic code is too scrambled to produce viable sperm. They are an evolutionary dead end.
A perfect example. Now, apply the brutal reality of Haldane's rule to Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. By the time our sapiens ancestors encountered Neanderthals in Eurasia, the two groups had been completely separated by geography for roughly 600,000 years.
6,000 centuries.
Yes, evolving in completely different climates, facing different diseases, eating different diets.
So biologically speaking, they weren't just long-lost cousins. They were standing right at the absolute brink of total biological incompatibility.
Exactly. When a sapiens and a Neanderthal mated, it wasn't a seamless blending. It was a genetic car crash.
Wow.
The biological evidence strongly indicates that the male hybrids born from these pairings were almost certainly completely sterile. The genetic distance was just too vast. The chromosomes couldn't properly align during cell division.
So if all the hybrid sons were sterile, how did any of the DNA survive to reach us today?
The only narrow, precarious escape hatch for Neanderthal genes was through the hybrid daughters.
Because females have two X chromosomes.
Right, which provides a bit of genetic redundancy and buffers them against the worst effects of Haldane's rule. The female hybrids were occasionally fertile and could reproduce with sapiens males.
But even then, we only kept 2%. What happened to the other 98% of the Neanderthal genome?
It was actively, aggressively purged.
Purged.
Yes. Even in the females, the vast majority of Neanderthal DNA was fundamentally incompatible with the sapiens' biological operating system. It caused autoimmune disorders, reduced fertility, and physical weaknesses.
It sounds brutal.
Over dozens of generations, natural selection acted like an antivirus program. It actively identified and deleted the incompatible Neanderthal code because it was literally getting people killed.
So that 1.5 to 2% that we still carry today, it is not a happy souvenir of a merged civilization.
Not at all.
It is the absolute bare minimum, the tiny fraction of highly localized, useful code, like a specific tweak for high-altitude breathing in Tibet, or a localized immune response to a Eurasian virus that managed to miraculously squeeze through a massive, brutal wall of infertility and genetic purging.
We did not merge with them. We absorbed a few useful biological updates through a highly inefficient, biologically traumatic process.
Which just proves how powerful that original original African isolation was. I mean, if 600,000 years of separation makes interbreeding nearly impossible, the millions of years our early ancestors spent trapped in the Turkana Basin cemented our unique biology forever.
Completely irreversible.
Okay, but let's wind the clock back to Africa, long before we ever met the Neanderthals. Let's look at the software of the human mind.
The cognitive leap.
Right, because the watery incubator built this incredible bipedal body, and while waiting in the water, they were gorging on aquatic diets, shellfish rich in omega-3 fatty acids like DHA and iodine.
Which are the literal molecular building blocks required to grow dense, complex neural tissue.
So their brains were getting massive.
They had the biological hardware of a large brain, yes.
But having a big brain and actually using it to build a civilization are two entirely different things. A computer with a massive hard drive is useless without an operating system.
Exactly.
For hundreds of thousands of years, these big-brain humans were still essentially just acting on animal instinct. They were making simple stone flakes, sure, but they weren't creating art or complex trade networks or cities. So what was the specific spark? What event forced the human software to finally boot up?
It wasn't a spark, it was a planetary catastrophe.
Okay.
The millions of years of solitude in that relatively stable African incubator was violently shattered roughly 74,000 years ago. A supervolcano known as Toba, located in present-day Indonesia, erupted.
And calling it an eruption almost undersells the magnitude, doesn't it?
It was one of the largest explosive events in the last 2 million years of Earth's history.
Toba didn't just affect Asia. It blew billions of tons of vaporized rock, ash, and sulfur dioxide straight into the stratosphere.
The sulfur aerosols wrapped around the entire globe, reflecting the sun's radiation back into space. The Earth was instantly plunged into a brutal volcanic winter. Global temperatures plummeted by several degrees. Sunlight was dimmed for years.
The ripple effects of that would be apocalyptic. If the sun is blocked, the equatorial plants die. The herbivores that eat the plants starve. The predators that eat the herbivores starve. The entire global food chain basically collapsed like a house of cards.
The environmental pressure was absolute and unforgiving. And for the human species, the consequences were nearly fatal. This event created what evolutionary geneticists refer to as an extreme population bottleneck.
And the numbers on this bottleneck are just staggering. The global human population didn't just dip, it crashed. We shrank down to a microscopic fraction of our former numbers.
Estimates suggest there may have been only a few thousand individual humans left alive on the entire planet.
Just a few thousand, globally.
A few thousand individuals clinging to survival in the absolute harshest conditions imaginable.
Imagine putting all of humanity, all the sprawling, diverse tribes across the African continent and forcing them through the world's finest microscopic sieve. Everything is blocked. Everyone dies. Only a few tiny random grains of sand managed to squeeze through the mesh. We were millimeters away from total extinction.
And we can actually see the physical scar of that exact bottleneck in our DNA today.
Really? Where?
It is written into a specific genetic marker known as the YAP insertion.
The YAP marker. Y chromosome allopolymorphism. Let's unpack that because it's a dense term.
Oh.
What is an allopolymorphism and how does it prove we almost died out?
An allo element is essentially a tiny mobile piece of DNA. It's a jumping gene that can copy and paste itself into different parts of the genome.
Okay.
A polymorphism just means a variation. So the YAP marker is a specific random mutation where a tiny piece of allo-DNA inserted itself into the Y chromosome of a single male.
So one guy gets a random biological typo in his DNA. Why is that important?
Because of the mathematics of populations. Imagine a large, healthy population of hundreds of thousands of people. If one single male is born with a harmless genetic typo like YAP, it doesn't matter. He might pass it to his sons, but it will remain a tiny, insignificant drop in a massive genetic ocean.
Over thousands of years, it might even wash out entirely.
Right. But what if the ocean evaporates? During the Toba volcanic winter, the population shrank so drastically that the pool of available males was practically reduced to zero. The denominator in our genetic equation became incredibly small.
So in that tiny, desperate, starving group of survivors, a male carrying the YAP mutation happened to be one of the few who survived and successfully reproduced.
Exactly.
It's like a massive printing press that burns down. You manage to save exactly one blueprint from the fire, but that specific blueprint happens to have a random ink smudge on the corner.
A perfect analogy.
When you rebuild the factory and start printing again, every single new copy has that exact same ink smudge.
Because the population was so small, that random genetic glitch didn't get washed out. Through the sheer brutal mathematics of surviving the bottleneck, that YAP marker rapidly became the standard base lawn hardware for a huge percentage of the males who made it through.
And as the climate slowly recovered and those survivors began to multiply and expand, they carried that ink smudge with them.
Today, that YAP marker defines major genetic lineages known as haplogroups, massive genetic clan families, specifically haplogroups D and E.
And those clans spread out from Africa, carrying that exact scar, eventually reaching all the way to Tibet and the islands of Japan. It is a living, breathing monument inside ourselves to how close the human story came to ending in the cold and the dark.
Barely surviving. But they did survive, and the question is how? If the environment was so lethal and food was so scarce, brute force wasn't going to save them.
This brings us back to the software, because surviving that winter required a cognitive leap. Now, I know the instinctive answer is to say, well, they started talking to each other, they invented language to survive. But I would assume these big-brained apes already had language, right? I mean, chimpanzees communicate. Birds have complex warning songs.
Animals certainly communicate. But there is a massive fundamental distinction between having a vocabulary and possessing true grammar.
Okay, what's the difference?
Animals have vocabulary. A vervet monkey, for instance, has a very specific alarm call that means leopard and a completely different distinct call that means eagle.
So they have labels for things.
Yes. But vocabulary is just a direct one-to-one label for a physical object that is present in the immediate current moment. Our pre-Toba ancestors likely had a very large vocabulary of grunts and calls to label their world.
Right.
But vocabulary alone cannot coordinate a complex long-term survival strategy.
Because with just vocabulary, you can't say, hey, I saw a leopard near the river yesterday, so we should go hunt in the hills tomorrow.
Exactly.
With vocabulary, you can only scream, leopard, here, now. You are trapped in the present tense.
You are entirely bound to the immediate physical space and time. But to survive the near extinction of the Toba winter, where a single missed meal meant starvation, humanity had to coordinate flawlessly over vast distances and timelines.
They couldn't just react to the present.
No, they had to collectively analyze the past and strategize for a hypothetical future. To do that, they needed to connect independent concepts. They needed to invent what linguists call agglutinative grammar.
Agglutinative grammar, the grammatical glue.
Precisely. It is the cognitive ability to take discrete, independent concepts like hunt, river, tomorrow, and we, and stick them together using abstract grammatical rules.
To build a complex thought about a situation that does not physically exist in front of you.
Yes.
It's the birth of abstract planning. And what's wild is that they didn't invent this grammar to write poetry or tell stories around a campfire. They invented it under extreme duress.
It is a forced survival tool.
If they didn't figure out how to perfectly coordinate the tribe's movements to find the last remaining edible roots, they died.
Grammar allows a mind to project a complex, abstract map of reality into the mind of another person. Once that syntactic software was booted up, it changed the trajectory of the species forever. It transformed a desperate group of starving apes into a hyper-coordinated, unified intelligence network.
So, equipped with this revolutionary new software of grammar, abstract thought, and intense social cooperation, these survivors slowly clawed their way back from the brink. The volcanic ash settled, the climate slowly warmed up, and the populations expanded.
A massive expansion into new territories.
And eventually, armed with their new cognitive tools, Homo sapiens finally burst out of Africa and migrated north into Eurasia.
Right.
But waiting for them in the freezing north was the apex predator of the Ice Age, the Neanderthals. We talked earlier about the biological incompatibility when they tried to mate, but let's look at the physical reality of these two incredibly advanced human species suddenly sharing the exact same hunting grounds in Europe.
It's a dramatic scenario.
Because if you read the descriptions of Neanderthal anatomy, it sounds like a setup for a brutal genocidal war.
It is the classic assumption. Two highly capable apex predator species enter the same ecological niche. One must violently destroy the other in a battle for dominance.
Especially when you look at the Neanderthal hardware. They were the ultimate Ice Age biological tanks.
Yes, they were.
They evolved under Bergman's and Allen's rules of biology, meaning they were shorter, incredibly stocky, with massive thick bones and barrel chests designed to retain body heat in a freezing climate. Their muscle mass and sheer physical density were astronomical compared to a sapiens.
They were hyper-specialized for a very dangerous way of life. Ambush hunting megafauna.
Like mammoths.
Right. A Neanderthal hunted by hiding in the brush, sprinting up to a massive aggressive animal like a woolly rhino or a mammoth, and physically driving a heavy, thick spear into it at close range.
The sheer physical power required for that is
Good
immense.
compatible power, yes.
So in a one-on-one, hand-to-hand physical confrontation, a slender, tall sapiens built for running and dissipating heat in Africa would have absolutely no chance. A Neanderthal would literally break a sapiens in half. So I have to assume that we didn't just march into Europe and challenge them to open combat. Did we just overwhelm them with sheer numbers in a bloody, thousands of years-long war?
No. That is the Hollywood version of history.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The archaeological record tells a completely different and far more fascinating story of how sapiens triumphed. There is absolutely zero physical evidence of systematic warfare between sapiens and Neanderthals.
No mass graves.
We haven't found mass graves of Neanderthal skeletons riddled with sapiens weapons. In fact, sapiens survived and triumphed precisely by completely avoiding physical friction with them.
So if we didn't violently eradicate them, how on earth did they disappear?
We didn't wipe them out with weapons, we starved them out with efficiency.
Wow.
And we did it using the ultimate output of our new cognitive software, technology and networking. First, consider the technological software, projectile weapons.
Right, sapiens didn't want to wrestle mammoths,
We invented tools like the Atwal, the spearshore,
which acts as an artificial extension of the arm, adding massive leverage and kinetic energy to a lighter dart.
which meant a sapiens hunter could stand 30 or 40 yards away, completely out of the danger zone, and bring down a dangerous animal. Neanderthals were still jumping onto the backs of rhinos.
Which meant their fossilized skeletons are covered in healed fractures. They were constantly getting maimed or killed just trying to secure dinner.
So our technology gave us a drastically lower mortality rate. But what about the grammar? How does the invention of complex language actually kill off a stronger species?
Networking.
It comes down to the size of the survival network.
Mm.
Because Neanderthals likely lacked the advanced, agglutinative grammar necessary to maintain complex social bonds over distance, their social groups remained small and isolated.
A typical Neanderthal band was just an extended family of maybe 10 to 30 individuals living in a single valley.
Right.
If a terrible blizzard hits that valley and the mammoth herds don't arrive, that small group starves to death in isolation because they don't have the vocabulary or the network to ask anyone else for help.
Exactly. But sapiens, using complex grammar and symbolic thought, could maintain massive, sprawling social networks that anthropologists call Dunbar's number.
Groups of 150 people or more.
Yes. More importantly, different sapiens tribes could communicate, trade, and forge alliances over vast geographical distances. If one valley suffered a famine, the sapiens living there simply relied on their extended linguistic network in the next valley over to share surplus food.
It is the ultimate exercise in energy economics, which brings us to the most brutal math of all, the daily calorie requirement.
Yeah.
Because Neanderthals were these massive, heavily muscled biological tanks trying to stay warm in an ice age, their resting metabolic rate was off the charts.
They required nearly double the daily caloric intake of a slender sapiens just to avoid starvation.
Double.
We are talking upwards of 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day. They were high-performance biological gas guzzlers. Sapiens were highly efficient aerodynamic economy cars.
And because sapiens had those safer projectile weapons and better communication networks, we didn't just target the big, dangerous game. We moved into their environment and efficiently vacuumed up absolutely everything.
Sapiens were supreme generalists. We used our cognitive flexibility to invent fishhooks and nets to harvest the rivers. We built snares to trap small, fast-breeding game like rabbits.
We used our networks to map out and gather a massive variety of seasonal plants.
We extracted calories from the environment in ways the Neanderthals simply couldn't fathom.
We were like a highly adaptable invasive weed that spreads its roots rapidly across the forest floor, efficiently soaking up all the water and nutrients until the massive ancient oak tree standing in the middle of the forest simply withers and dies from lack of resources.
That is exactly what happened. The Neanderthals, trapped in their high-calorie bodies and isolated in their small, disconnected groups, looked around and found that the carrying capacity of their environment had collapsed.
They simply couldn't find enough food to fuel their massive frames.
They didn't die in a glorious, bloody war against us. They quietly faded away into the snow, driven to extinction through relentless, merciless caloric starvation. We won because we were biologically cheaper to run and culturally infinitely better connected.
That is deeply profound. It wasn't the strong who survived, it was the efficient and the connected.
Absolutely.
But hold on. Holding together a massive, sprawling network of 150 people introduces a massive internal problem. If you put 150 highly intelligent, aggressive apes in a single camp, they don't naturally form a peaceful trade network.
No, they don't.
They form factions, they fight over resources, and they tear each other apart. So how did we lower our own internal friction? There's a concept here that completely redefines human nature, self-domestication. How on earth did we tame ourselves?
To understand self-domestication, you have to look at the most vulnerable member of the human species, the infant.
The babe.
Right. Because we evolved that narrow bipedal pelvis for walking, while simultaneously evolving a massive brain fueled by an aquatic diet, human childbirth became incredibly difficult. To survive birth, human babies must be born incredibly premature compared to other mammals.
All right, a newborn horse can stand up and run within hours. A baby chimpanzee can immediately physically cling to its mother's fur while she climbs. But a human baby is essentially a helpless, completely dependent lump for years.
It is a massive, long-term caloric and physical burden. A human mother simply cannot forage for enough food, defend herself from predators, and carry a helpless infant alone.
She desperately needs help.
Specifically, she needs the father to stick around and invest his energy into raising the child.
But in a typical primate society, males don't stick around to help raise kids.
Not at all. In chimpanzee or gorilla societies, males compete fiercely, often violently, for mating rights. Whenever a female shows visible biological signs of estrus when she goes into heat, the males battle each other for access.
It creates a hierarchical system of constant, bloody, internal warfare and reactive aggression.
If human males continued to operate on that hyper-aggressive biological imperative, the fathers would be too busy fighting each other, the mothers would starve, the helpless infants would die, and the human species would go extinct in a single generation.
So the biology had to radically shift to force the males to put down their fists and cooperate.
And it did so through a profound biological alteration. Human females evolved concealed ovulation. They lost all visible signs of estrus.
Because if the males no longer know exactly when a female is fertile, the old strategy of violently fighting other males for a brief 48-hour mating window becomes completely useless.
Exactly. The biological math changes. If a male wants to ensure he passes on his genes, the most successful strategy is no longer fighting.
Right.
The best strategy becomes pairing off, staying with one specific female continuously, guarding her, and crucially, cooperating to provide food for her and that incredibly demanding, big-brained infant.
That is staggering. Concealed ovulation eliminated the trigger for constant, bloody mating battles. It biologically incentivized monogamy, or at least long-term pair bonding.
It forced males to cooperate.
To live side by side in a large camp of 150 people without constantly trying to kill each other. We essentially domesticated ourselves, lowering our testosterone, shrinking our brow ridges, and suppressing our reactive aggression, all just to keep our bizarre, helpless babies alive.
Self-domestication is the emotional bedrock of humanity. Without that biological reduction in reactive aggression, we could never tolerate living in large societies.
The cognitive software of grammar and trade networks would have no stable physical hardware to run on.
We had to become gentle with each other before we could conquer the world.
So, bringing this all together, for everyone listening right now, take a moment and look down at your own hands. Look at your lack of thick body fur.
Think about the downward-facing shape of your nose, designed to keep water out of your airway while waiting.
Look in the mirror at the whites of your eyes, a trait we alone possess, evolved not to see better, but so we could silently read the direction of each other's gaze and cooperate without making a sound.
Right.
Remember that you did not conquer nature. Your ancestors did not heroically stride out onto the savannah with a grand plan. Nature violently trapped your ancestors in a flooded prison. It stripped them naked, it stood them up against their will, it boiled away their genetic incompatibilities, and it shaped them like clay through millions of years of sheer, relentless, terrifying pressure.
And if we take that realization and apply it to our present moment, it leaves us with a highly provocative thought.
What's that?
For 10 million years, the human body and the human mind were meticulously hammered into shape by specific, brutal physical frictions. Deep alkaline water, extreme solar heat, and freezing volcanic winters.
Those intense physical pressures built the exact biology you operate today.
Look around you right now. Today, we live in environments entirely of our own making. We spent our days bathed in artificial climate control, sitting still in ergonomic chairs, staring at glowing digital screens, consuming hyper-processed, pre-chewed calories.
We have systematically removed almost every single piece of physical friction from our daily lives.
We have. Which raises the ultimate question. If being trapped in a flooded forest was enough to turn a small, quadrupedal ape into a bipedal, talking human, what exactly is our current, entirely frictionless, artificial environment slowly mutating us into right now?
Wow, that is a thought that is going to linger for a long time. Are we devolving or just adapting to a new kind of invisible prison? Thank you all so much for joining us on this deep dive into the true story of our past. Keep questioning the comforting stories you've been told, look closely at the physical evidence all around you, and we will catch you on the next one.